All right, I think I should be good. Hello, Dr. Kapora. This is my vlog for the week of September 20th. And yeah, just following the format. And let me pull up my notes on all of this. I thought I'd focus in primarily on the first bit of the Rothberg book, Corruption, Global Security, and World Order, as well as the following corruption and human trafficking content that's out there. Not sure how long this one will go, and hopefully, yeah, I think I'm all good. All right. So as chapter one begins, Rotberg is just want to make sure I'm pronouncing that right. Um, he immediately started out by comparing the definitions of corruption from the past once again to modern day, and as well he kind of pointed out he was focusing on Mesopotamia, and like earlier, when we were focusing primarily on um, we were focusing on Greece and Egypt and all these other societies. I had not really ever considered it to be that way. Yeah, as I noted previously, that corruption to me and possibly other people who aren't studying it directly in the same fashion we are might consider it to be a more novel concept rather than something that has been being debated for literally upwards of 1,000, 2,000 years. Um, and he did state that corruption was not, less a limiter, but almost, a driver of nations' development. And that, in fact, it's commingled with what drives a nation forward in the modern world, or in fact, in the historical world at any point. Um, and he said effectively that merit alone will will only drive the smallest amount of nations. And it was surprising to me that he used the United States Senate seats as a prime example. As that's almost a form of, we wouldn't call it corruption. We would just call it the way our politics are. But it seems that whoever has the most money, whoever can raise funds best, or um, can fund their campaign in a proper way, can then move forward in politics, which, if we were to see that anywhere else in the world, we might be wagging our finger and saying, hey, wait a minute, that's not how politics are meant to be run, yet that's how it occurs here at home, which is just something not many people happen to consider, it seems. He's got a he Rothberg himself has a very platonic worldview on corruption, it seems, because he refers to it in the beginning primarily as a temptation, that it is not something inborn. It is a byproduct of having power and choosing to use that power in a particular manner. Um, and he this immediately went into trafficking, which I'll talk a little bit more extensively about later, um, and how that is a prime example of corruption, as well as you know my focus on that when it comes to trafficking is really the sheer quantity in modern day society to allow trafficking, that so many people are brought into various forms, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, um, that globalization has almost entirely purported forward. And uh, as the one reading discussed, that there were enabling norms and prohibitive norms, and but we'll get into that a little bit later. Um, and then immediately after that, he follows up with the kleptocratic interdependence, which was a mouthful, but is at the very least something interesting, and is after reading how he describes it, it seems to be something that I would expect to hear elsewhere a little bit more often. Kind of one of these revolutionary bottom billion style ideas that you'd expect to be heard elsewhere, um, with the focus on non-state actors influencing policy, elections, and the one quote that ties back to what I was saying about money in the U.S. elections. He had said that a politician who is poor is a poor politician. Um, and it was very interesting to me that he pointed out that these kleptocratic interdependencies follow democratic nations rather than developing ones. That they find the opportunity to thrive and kind of take advantage of a situation from already developed nations, or you know developing nations can have democracies, but either way, nations that one might consider to have more methods of combating corruption and illicit activities. Uh, Proliferation as a result of corruption was something that I actually had not considered whatsoever, uh, at all up until this point. The idea of nuclear theft kind of went over my head. I imagine that that'll be described further in greater detail um, in the chapters that follow. But once he made the point of you know secrets and information being used by high-ranking offenders and suspects for nuclear proliferation, and non-state actors to be able to take advantage of the information that the high-ranking people provide, that drives a conversation about corruption not really needing to have commodity tied behind it. That there's not always going to be money, or power, or people, or whatever, but that information can really be something corrupted. And that's a very pertinent point in our modern world, the globalized digital world, where information is constantly spreading. There's all the threats of leaks, and among other things. So it's kind of dangerous. And at the rate that everything's advancing, and how integrated things might be, it's interesting to see how corruption um, might follow in the future, just with greater forms of integration, how the human error might actually fall out of it. And let's see. He did have a lot of solutions to these, or stated solutions to these problems, which I happen to not exactly disagree with, but they were kind of infiltrated by UN speak. That sort of bureaucratic. We must compel corporations, or adhere to UN doctrine. Things that don't really have a pertinent effect behind them. Something that doesn't affect the moment. And he then did follow it up by saying stiffer penalties, upgrading detection methods, things that are more practical, things that people should certainly get behind. But the fact that those were prefaced by the sort of intangible, compel corporations to do better about withholding information, or retrain, re-equip, rehire new people away from the the already corrupted circles, or circles where corruption had taken root at points. It's sure it exists, but without some form of penalty, or some weight behind it, there's really not much. The something that I caught on, which, like, it just now finally clicked, like a month into the class. In the first chapter, he had mentioned the previous Soviet war, or Soviet era areas, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan in particular, because that was my 178. And he touched on Nagorno-Karabakh, and I don't know why this did not click until now, but the entirety of my report on that particular country revolved around the fact that, yeah, the president was corrupt. He managed to do X, Y, and Z, and now he's less a president, more previously elected or previously democratically elected dictator at this point, or well, however you might want to put it. But um, it's interesting, and now I've kind of got hindsight 2020. It'd be interesting to go back and take a look at this situation with the new knowledge of what we're learning, human security and human trafficking, and the history of the history of corruption and all the elements and things of that nature that allow it to flourish. Um, and let's see, yeah, and then immediately following that, I wanted to talk about Russia, and really it seems there's a portion of this corruption that is that exists the whole way, and was discussed in the one in class video, of which the name I can't remember, but that was the past week. But anyways, Russia kind of seems to be this transitory location of corruption. Almost like a Silk Road of it, where goods are smuggled, including he had mentioned wildlife corpses, the things poached by corrupt officials and other groups. Um, Transactions were allowed. Drugs are trafficked, arms are trafficked, everything that you'd expect to follow a nationwide corruption case being trafficked. But what I wanted to focus on there was geography being played as a role. And again, the video that we'd watched last week in class had said, yeah, geography does play a role. Bad neighbors can really, allow corruption to take hold and take root. But Russia has this, very unique lot on the world, and they did previously during the Cold War with the USSR's, kind of branching out. It had so much more than it currently does, and really that alone can likely fuel corruption, or at least obviously play a factor into it, where there's so much land, there's so much interconnectivity that a blind eye here along one border of Russia and a blind eye there along another border of Russia, it could allow something illicit to travel, hundreds, thousands of miles with very little difficulty, and really that raises into question the idea of nation states and other things like that were covered in the Dedocracy documentary, because they had mentioned the Eurozone versus how America had run things. And again, I'm still not particularly well versed on it, but the fact that Greece was a peripheral of the Eurozone allowed particular corruption to flourish, is somewhat comparable to this, in the idea that Russia is quite large, and Russia may be its own entity, but geography could allow corruption to further spread, or at least encourage it. That was followed up by Papua New Guinea being brought up, and that was another case from 178 who I can't remember who had it. I just remember it being spoken about. And I just wanted to bring this up because I remember that extractive industries, I believe, were the main topic, that it was like illegal logging, mining, other things along those lines, kind of drove the discussion. And that obviously that ties back into what we kind of started this class with, the idea that extractive industries were some of the most primo targets for corrupt institutions, or corruption to breed within corporations, other things along those lines. And then they talked about after that, how you might combat this in Papua New Guinea, and he focused on educational availability, opportunity, and it's kind of funny because that's that's another prime avenue for something to be corrupted, as we've seen before with people attempting to get educated and needing to pay off the schoolmaster so that their student can, or that their son or daughter can get in for the year, and among other things. So a lot of this does boil down to transparency, sure, and accountability, sure, um, but education and awareness in countries that don't grace the mind of American citizens, every day. Education awareness in places like that, in Papua New Guinea and other locations, is seemingly the way to go. It's a common thread between so many of these things, these writings, these documentaries. But the question is, how do we educate, and will that even do anything? Um, they then went into speaking about Nigeria, um, and that they're not citizens aren't free from accidentally perpetuating corruption themselves. It's just kind of a daily life thing. But it's interesting to me that out of 36 available governors, 31 of them were indicted for financial forms of corruption, including embezzlement, which that's mind-boggling to us. It's if what 40 something out of 50 states governors were all of a sudden noted for cronyism, embezzlement, in illegal fashions, and among other things. So to take in that kind of perspective would be a little bit wild. Um, and then following that was Malawi, which this was actually incredibly interesting to me. The human right to a non-corrupt life that they discussed in it. Um, that everything was done nominally in favor of a non-corrupt life. Ratifications, clauses in their constitution, they signed the UNCAC, um, but they still happen to live a largely corrupt life. And the idea that to live in a non-corrupt society is a human right could really help drive the discussion. I think that's was really interesting to me that I hadn't considered it in that fashion. Um, and then it ties into the normative dimension. That's something I wanted to pick up on because the readings following about human trafficking were so heavily focused on the normatives. Um, and tying into that, currently I'm taking Dr. Nicole John Danzel's human trafficking course, so a lot of this is cross sectionally relevant for my courses. Um, but I did want to pick up on what I mentioned earlier, the enabling norms and the prohibitive norms, um, and how the enabling norms have managed to persist even into this globalized era. No matter how many people condemn human trafficking for labor or sex or whatever else, no matter how many of us say, like, that is the prime crime, that's the worst thing you can do to another human being is enslave them. Murder is less bad. Um, Yet for 2,000 years, it's managed to persist longer than that. Probably since man has been able to speak. Uh, it's stood the test of time, and it was well constructed. These enabling norms were well constructed for those who had reason to take use of them, and obviously you can't look at enabling or prohibitive norms without looking at the other. So the prohibitive norms, the reading said, needed to be packaged for the public to gain momentum, understanding for the movements and ideals for the general public, people who previously, before the abolition movement and among other things within the United States, may not have ever even considered prohibition and abolition because it just wasn't what was. It wasn't normative. It wasn't the way they lived. And then they tied that into Sweden's model, which is it's called the question about how well it really works. Primarily because it's focused on equality, gender equality, but equality in general. And is it really doing anything for human trafficking? Is it really actually fighting them? That those that kind of bring others into effectively a forced form of labor, um, that they what am I trying to say here? They bring others into a forced form of labor, but compensate them for it, and it's still trafficking effectively. But then the two talks I did not watch fully yet. However, I just want to touch on the fact that there's really not much anti-corruption like resistance, or there's not much resistance against anti-corruption activists here in the United States. However, there is a negligence to the existence of it, where we don't really search it out, or we don't really consider it when it might be in front of our face in the fact of the U.S. Senate seats. Should we consider that to be corrupt, and on what grounds? But that's another discussion. And something I want to say is that we might be able to promote accountability, integrity, or whatever else people might wish to hear about platitudes and development. But again, education and transparency are really what we seem to need to focus on. I'm kind of pushing 20 minutes, so I'm going to try and wrap up real quick. But I did want to touch on human trafficking on the other end. And again, this is where education and awareness and training and all other things of that manner really need to be called into question. We focus so much on how prevalent human trafficking is within the United States at sporting events and other things within the human trafficking sociology course. And sure, we've developed far from what the norms of the world were previously, but there's a lot of pockets of the world where enabling norms are the norm. And it's, what really catches me off guard when it comes to human trafficking is the sheer quantity. That sure, Earth's population might be at the greatest it's ever been, the highest quantity, but human trafficking victims are at a proportionally greater quantity than they have been at any other point in history, if I'm correct. And it's possibly a byproduct of globalization and everything that's followed that. But really, what I want to boil that down to is comparing it to corruption. If you were to take, the political idea, sense of corruption, and the human trafficking aspects as two separate things, and attempt to compare them, it's really, as we've said, boils down to the vulnerable, the exploited, being exploited, and others in a position of power attempting to conflate and rise their abilities, their power, and put themselves in a higher position, maybe over others in the case of human trafficking, or actually having political, economic, sociologic, however you want to put it, power over a nation state. And yeah, that's just what I wanted to boil it down to. And as I've noted before, it would be incredibly interesting to see the positions that these authors and others might take on what we're witnessing today. As I've noted before, Donald Trump's drain the swamp kind of thing. How many corrupt politicians and the Epstein family and Hollywood, like the sexual harassment and stuff like that. It boils down to corruption in one sense or another, whether it's how one might attempt to call moralistic corruption, or whether these are societal norms that have just now been upheaved. Who knows? I would love to get input from any of the authors and write whoever that we've listened to and read from at this point. But I pushed 25 minutes here. I don't want to go too long, since I know me talking isn't exactly the most interesting thing. So that's the end of the my vlog for the week of September 20th.